Hey guys, it's Alexis, aka The Soft Reader, and I'm here today to do my July wrap-up. To check in with my TBR, I read everything on my TBR with the exception of The Well of Ascension, which is the one book I said I was comfortable with not finishing in the month of July. So I'm super proud of myself for completing everything I said I wanted to read. I did it! And I read a whole bunch of stuff more. I read 12 things in the month of July, which is usually about 4 books more than I can usually read in a month, so I'm super proud of myself. I also participated in Booktubeathon this month, and I vlogged the first 4 days of that, which you can go and check out if you're interested. Yeah, so this month I'm going to just mention the things I read in the order I read them so that I can keep certain things together, but it's a lot of stuff. I ramble, so we're gonna go ahead and get straight on into it. The first thing I read in the month of July was Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is the second book in the Wayward Children series, and it's also a prequel for the first book, Every Heart a Doorway. I have to admit, I am pretty disappointed in this book. I didn't love it, like a lot of other people seem to. The main reason being the writing in this one just didn't really suit me. In this book there's more of an omniscient narrator, and they're constantly addressing you as an audience, and I am not a fan of that personal writing style, so I didn't really like that. Also, this book is only about 180 pages, and this book spent 60% getting to like the part in the story I was interested in. So more of the book focused on the two main characters getting to the moors, which is this magical world that they go to. It spent more time on their childhood and like on them getting to the moors than it actually spent on them in the moors, which I really didn't like. So I think I'm going to end up giving Down Among the Sticks and Bones a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is kind of a bummer. Following that, I decided to reread Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire because I wanted to see if the writing was similar in this one than it was to Down Among the Sticks and Bones, and if I just didn't notice because I listened to this on audiobook for the first time. The first time I read this, I gave this a 4 stars. Upon a second reread, I actually bumped my rating up to a 4.5 stars. Because genuinely I loved this book. I loved it the second time around just as much as I did the first time. The problems I had with the sequel are for the sequel only. I didn't find those issues present in this first book. I still think the ending in this first book wraps up way too fast, but I still found this book magical and compelling, and yeah, still definitely one of my favorite books of the year. After those two, I picked up The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh. This is the sequel to The Wrath and the Dawn, which I read in June, and this one pretty much takes up right where the first book ended. I ended up giving this one a 3.5 stars. Ultimately, that's because this book spent a lot of time focusing on things I didn't care about. It spent a lot of time on a side romance that I just wasn't interested in. It spent a lot of time focusing on the character of Tariq, who I don't care about. Literally my least favorite. So this book spent so much time focusing on the things I didn't care about and not nearly enough time on the things that I was really interested in, like Shazi discovering her magic and the storyline with Artan and his family. So ultimately ended up giving this one a 3.5. I still enjoyed the characters for the most part, and I still thought the writing was beautiful, but it wasn't as good as the first book. The next book I read in the month of July was Champion by Marie Lu. This is the third book in the Legend trilogy. Oh man, I can officially say that I love this trilogy. This trilogy is one of my favorites. Honestly, I think it's probably the best YA dystopian trilogy that came out during that huge dystopian craze. I think this series is fantastic. I think Marie Lu does an amazing job at writing a compelling storyline and interesting characters, and she does a great job with character growth. And watching Day and June grow over the course of 3 books was just so good. It was so amazing. Like, I gave Champion 5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was a fantastic conclusion. I loved the way everything happened and it all wrapped up, and I pretty much can't really talk about it because it's just me gushing about how much I love Marie Lu as an author, so yeah, I just gave it 5 stars. The next book I'm going to mention is Because You'll Never Meet Me by Leah Thomas. This was on my top 15 to read in 2017 list. I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The first half of this book is really good. I loved the first half of this book. Like, it could have been a 4.5 easily. The second half of this book I liked significantly less. There was a weird shift in genre that is hinted at in the first half of the book, but I just found myself not wanting the book to go there, and then it did. Because it starts out with a contemporary with like a slight science fiction element to it, and then the second half of this book just goes like full-blown science fiction, and I really didn't like that. I wish the book could have strayed away from that. There's also one of the characters in this book is queer, and there's like a romantic subplot for him that I didn't like, and I wish the book wouldn't have gone there. Like, when it happened, I literally just put the book down and I was like, why did we have to do that? So, gave this one a 3.5 stars. There is a sequel that I would be interested in reading, and I definitely think that this could be a book other people could really love, but ultimately, for me, it was just okay. The next book I'm going to mention is Always and Forever Laura Jean by Jenny Han. This is the third and final book in the To All the Boys I've Loved Before trilogy, and I'm a sucker for this trilogy, and I loved this book. I gave this book a 4 stars, which is really good. That's what I gave the second book in the series as well. And overall, I just think that this book is so good. I think this whole series is super good. The first book is still my favorite in the series, but I still found this book cute, and I still found this book funny, and there were a lot of things going on in Laura Jean's life that I so heavily related to, because she's a senior in high school in this book, and she's like applying to colleges and stuff. And no kidding, her dream school was my dream school, and so her admissions process with them was so similar to my admissions process with them. And so it was like, the whole time I was reading it, I was having like a weird like flashback to me as a senior in high school. And so just, I love this book. I gave it 4 stars. Not my favorite in the series, but I genuinely also just thought it was a fun time. I'm glad this third book was written because I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed seeing everything in the series have a really truly proper wrap up that I felt like neither the first or second book really delivered. So I liked it. I love the series. It's one of my favorites. And you should all go read it if you like contemporaries, because it's cute. So at this point in July, the Book2-a-thon had started the last week in July, and so the first thing I technically completed during that week was a book I had already been about 270 pages into, and that was Because You Love to Hate Me, which is the villain anthology curated by Amory here on BookTube, which paired the 13 authors with 13 booktubers. So ultimately, I decided to give this book a 3 stars. The stories themselves, which I did individual reviews for on Goodreads, if you're interested in checking that out, they averaged out to about a 3.6 total on like the individual ratings per book, but I did ultimately decide to take that down to a 3 for the book as a whole, purely because I gotta be honest, the booktuber stuff was not good. I don't see why they needed to be there. There were about 3 or 4 booktuber contributions I thought were good, that I thought added to the story or to the reading experience. The rest of them I thought were totally unnecessary. They didn't need to be there. I wish the pages had gone to helping flesh out some of the weaker stories in this collection, and so to review the whole book as a total gets a 3 stars. Of the short stories, my favorite ones were Death Knell by Victoria Schwab, Marigold by Samantha Shannon, and Beautiful Venom by Cindy Pond. Those are my 3 favorite stories in the collection. I definitely think that some of the stories in this collection were worth it. I also think that a lot of what went into this was just okay or worse. So, gotta admit, overall I was pretty disappointed in this one. The next book I started and finished for Book2-a-thon as a challenge to read a book in a day, and that was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This was actually a reread for me. I hadn't read this book in like 10 years, and so I decided to pick it up for this because it's not very big. I gave it 4 stars this time around, which is the same rating I would have given it the first time I read it. I genuinely just think that this is such an interesting story and time, and obviously this book was published in the 60s. I still find Ponyboy's story interesting, and the connection that this group of boys have is just so sweet but sad, and it's just like, it's such a friendship that you're like, yes, boys. And yeah, I still gave it the same rating I did the first time around. I still think it's a good read. The next book I completed for Booktubeathon was The Son of Neptune by Rick Riordan, which was a book to read outside, and I listened to this on audiobook. This is the second book in the Heroes of Olympus series, and I have to admit I gave this one a 3.5 stars, and I think this might be my least favorite Rick Riordan book I've read yet. That purely being because this one follows a new set of characters while the first book in the series is going on. So it's basically like you're having to learn characters and a setting all over again. So it felt like you were reading the first book in a series, which kind of I hated. I mean, that really dampened my enjoyment because I was kind of like, okay, I kind of just want to get to the plot of the actual book, which of course it took like, you know, 30-40% of the way before we were like really starting the story. So I didn't like that. I also don't like that in this series a lot of the characters feel very similar to one another. The characters of Piper and Hazel I feel like are very similar. I think Leo and Frank are also very similar characters. And so add that to the fact that Rick's books are all kind of formulaic anyway, and I just didn't enjoy this book nearly as much as I've enjoyed the rest of the books that I've read by him. So I'm still going to continue on with the series, and I hope it picks up after this one, because like I said, I didn't love this book. The next book is a book I finished for Booktubeathon, which I've been actually reading this book since February, so I finally got around to finishing it, and that is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And I have to warn you guys, unpopular opinion, I didn't like this. I gave this book 2 stars. I can appreciate what this book does for feminist literature and the dystopian genre, but I didn't like this. My main hindrance for this book was the world building and the writing. Personally, for the world building, I spent 70% of this book with like a laundry list of questions, and some of them were answered, you know, more than half of the way through, and some of them I don't feel like were ever answered, which was frustrating for me. And then the writing style, this is a prime example of my personal least favorite style of writing. So, you know, Margaret Atwood is really heavy on comma usage, which I really dislike. Also in this book, Margaret Atwood doesn't use quotation marks, which is a huge pet peeve of mine. I don't even know why it bothers me, but I literally instantly dislike a writing style that doesn't use quotation marks. Also, this book ends with like a thing called The History of the Handmaid's Tale, which is like an epilogue from the future looking back on that. Anyway, I hated that. Literally, I hated it. I don't think it added anything to the story. I also thought it was boring to read, and just completely unnecessary. So yeah, I have to admit, I really disliked this, which is a shame because I thought I was gonna love it, and I didn't. I didn't like this at all. The next book I'm going to mention was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that is The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. I started and finished this all during Booktubeathon, and I loved the hell out of it. I gave this a 5 stars. This book was everything I wanted it to be. This book had all of my like notes were hitting. I loved the main character Monty. I thought Monty was hilarious, but I also loved his character development over the course of the novel was so good. Loved the other 2 main characters, Percy and Felicity. I thought they both brought so much to the story in terms of humor and in terms of helping Monty to grow as a main character. Monty, our main character, is bisexual, and the relationship he has with his best friend Percy, who is biracial, I loved. I also loved how much this book dealt with a lot of serious topics, like racism and homophobia. Also, one of the main characters has epilepsy, and this book presented a realistic example of how epilepsy was treated during this time period, which, as someone who has studied that specifically, I loved. This book also has a slight fantastical element to it that deals with alchemy, which I also loved because personally I've done a lot of study on pseudoscience in a historical context, which is what this book is, and I loved it. I loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. I thought this book was fantastic. I already want to reread it. And yeah, it was so good. Definitely my favorite book of the month, hands down. Best book I read this month. Definitely one of my favorites I've read all year. Also maybe just one of my new favorite books, period. I loved it. The next book I'm going to mention is the last book I read for Booktubeathon, last book I read for the month, and that was Saga Volume 3. And I have to admit, I really love the Saga story. I love how the story is progressing, and I love seeing these characters kind of grow, and just as they're meeting new people and new situations are arising, how they're reacting to it. I love that. I know a lot of people really love the art style. It's not my favorite art style. I'll admit I think it's good, but it's just not my style personally. Saga's pretty graphic. There's a lot of really graphic violence and sexuality constantly throughout this. Sometimes I feel like it might be for shock value than for actual like storytelling. So if that's something that bothers you, I do want to warn you for that. But overall, Volume 3 was my favorite that I've read yet. So I gave this one at like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. But yeah, I'm gonna plan to hopefully get through the catch up on Saga over the next couple of months. But I read Volume 3 in July and I really, really liked it. Alright guys, so those were the 12 things I completed in the month of July. I would love to hear what you guys read in July, or if you read any of these and you want to talk to me about it, and I'll see you guys soon with another video. Bye!